and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. Today we're going to talk about Matilda of Boulogne. Lady Matilda was born in the year of our Lord 1202, probably in Boulogne. Her mother was Ida, Countess of Boulogne, and her father was Renaud, Count of Dumbarton. Her mother was 42 and her father was 37. Now, I know what you're thinking. That's a strange age for that time to have your first baby. Well, her parents had a rocky start to their marriage, to say the least. Her mother, still the single Countess of Boulogne, was about 30 years old, and she was kidnapped by Count Renaud. And she was forced to marry him, because if they got married, he acquired possession of everything, including her county. So, not a meet cute. But Ida would have seen this as somewhat normal behavior, unfortunately. Ida's mother had been Marie, a 24-year-old religious virgin living in a convent, and also the Countess of Boulogne. She had been kidnapped and forced to marry Matthew, so that he could be the Count of Boulogne. And her mother was for a time Queen of England. She was married to King Stephen. We talked about him in Empress Matilda's episode. He was the Stephen that she was fighting against. So the daughter and the granddaughter of King Stephen were both kidnapped and forced to marry because married women had no property rights. And they had a lot of property. But back to our Matilda. Steve's great-granddaughter. She didn't have the easiest start to life. When Matilda was about 12 years old, it got harder. Her father rebelled against the King of France, Philip Augustus, his childhood friend. Her father's lands were taken and given to the king's son, Philip. Her father was put in prison, and not a nice prison. This wasn't a castle arrest. Reportedly, Renaud languished in prison, and in pitiful conditions. He was chained to a heavy log, which two men had to lift every time he wanted to go use the toilet. Unaided, he could only move half a pace in his chains. 2 years later, when Matilda was about 14, her mother died. We don't know of what, but she was in her mid-50s. And there Matilda was, a 14-year-old with possession of her mother's county. Like her mother and grandmother before her, she had to attempt to avoid being kidnapped and forced to marry. She did that for about 7 years. When Matilda was 21, she decided to marry. At least she would have some say in who she married. She married the king's half-brother, Philip. He was arguably illegitimate, but he also had her father's lands. So they were in the possession of her husband, but they were all together again, and if she had children, all of her father's lands and her mother's lands would go to her children. King Louis the Lion had children, so her husband was not likely to ever be king, but they would be comfortable for the rest of their lives. They were getting pretty far down in the succession line, so we don't have surviving records, but we do know Matilda and Philip had a daughter and a son, probably in that order. Just 3 years into her marriage to the king's half-brother, the king, Louis the Lion, died. Dysentery. But we will get into that next episode. What mattered to Matilda is that her husband decided to rebel against his widowed sister-in-law. This was his chance. This was the strongest he was ever going to be. If he was going to shoot his shot, now was the time, even if the odds probably weren't in his favor. I feel like this would have worried Matilda. Remember her father, rebelled against the king, and now wasting away in prison? Her husband ended up being paid off by his sister-in-law to go away. And he took the deal. He wouldn't be king of France, but he was much wealthier now. The following year, Matilda may have received word that her father had died in prison at his own hands. Her husband also died, and she reigned as the countess of approximately everything for 3 years. So she was at her highest risk of being kidnapped and forcibly married. She decided to pick husband number 2. She was very rich. She had options. For her second husband, 36-year-old Countess Matilda chose 26-year-old Alfonso, heir to the throne of Portugal. She was going to be the future queen consort of Portugal. Was this a good choice? They didn't seem to enjoy their marriage. They didn't have any children in 10 years. And then her brother-in-law, the King of Portugal, died without any children. The king is dead. Long live the king. The new king was Matilda's 38-year-old husband, King Alfonso III. Matilda was the queen consort of Portugal, but not so fast. Her husband was immediately like, "New phone, who dis?" He renounced his wife and her lands and said, "Now that I'm king, we're not married." So I'm going to guess it wasn't the happiest decade for them. This fight lasted 5 years, at which point the king said, "No, we are divorced. I'm going to marry Beatrice of Castile." So Matilda charged him with bigamy. She didn't care how good the settlement was. She was the Queen of Portugal. Matilda was never granted entrance into Portugal and just stayed in France. Her daughter predeceased her and left no children that we know about. Her son renounced his family and his claim and moved to England for unknown reasons. We don't know about any of his children either. Matilda died in 1259 at the age of 56 or 57, about the same age her mother had been when she died. And that is where I'll leave it for now. What did you think about Matilda, Countess of Boulogne, and her generational trauma? It was a sad one, but I think it was kind of a triumphant story. She started her life with more problems than most and became Queen of Portugal, kind of. She held it together when it would have been easier just to give up. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at Long Live the Queen Podcast. Long live to all the queens out there. And until next time, bye.
You'll be remembered.
Thanks for listening.